This video will explain how to approach your IGCSE English Language Reading coursework. You are going to be producing one comparative essay, and this gives you 10% of your IGCSE in English Language. Your essay title is Compare the Presentation of Suffering in Text 1 and Text 2. So what are the text options? They are the poem Out Out by Robert Frost, the poem Disabled by Wilfred Owen, and a prose extract called The Last Night, which is taken from the novel Charlotte Gray by Sebastian Faulks. Isn't that 3 texts? Yes, because you can choose to write on 2 or 3 texts, and we study 3 to give you choice. And you could mainly write on 2 and then maybe make a point of connection with a third, but there is no requirement to do so. Here is the very top of the mark scheme so that you can see what it is that you need to do in order to get the highest marks. We'll come back to this later to pick it apart in more detail. But ultimately, you need to get into band 9 to get an A star. So let's think about the theme, suffering. 3 key areas to think about: causes of suffering, forms of suffering, impacts of suffering. Firstly, causes. So you can think about ideas such as naivety causing suffering. Is it irresponsibility that causes suffering? Are there social issues that cause suffering? Actions of other people causing suffering? Is the suffering situational? It's because people are in a particular situation that they suffer. Is it an issue of injustice that leads to suffering? Is it the judgmental attitudes of other people that lead to the suffering of somebody? Or is the suffering self-inflicted? Then forms. 2 key forms, physical and psychological. And also we think about whether or not it is an individual who is suffering, or whether the suffering is shared between people. Thirdly, impacts. For example, does the suffering actually impact in death? Does it lead to permanent suffering, or just temporary pain? Does it lead to anger, resentment, or other emotions? Does it actually have a positive outcome of leading to forgiveness? Does it also lead perhaps to greater sense of understanding and insight into other people's situation? Empathy. We understand people's suffering more and we can associate with them. Or perhaps our changed identity. Maybe somebody changes who they feel they are or how other people see them. So these are your big concepts. And the idea is that when you look at the 2 or 3 texts, you will look at how writers explore these concepts and how suffering is represented in different ways through particular language and structural choices. So the title again, compare the presentation of suffering in text 1 and text 2. Here are 2 possible approaches to this essay. You could work through those 3 aspects: causes of suffering in both texts, forms of suffering in both texts, impacts of suffering in both texts, leading to an evaluative comparison, which text shows the greatest suffering, and that would be your conclusion. So you are effectively comparing as you go all the way through the essay. Now each of those boxes isn't necessarily a separate paragraph. It may be you need 2 or 3 paragraphs to cover the forms of suffering, for example, but that maybe gives you the overall structure of the essay. An alternative approach would be to focus on text 1 in a lot of detail, the causes, the forms, and the impacts of the suffering, and then after that to move on to text 2. Now again, this would not necessarily all be 1 paragraph on a text 1. It may be that you work through the different aspects of causes, forms, and impacts of suffering for text 1 with separate paragraphs, but then you move on to text 2 and you start making connections back to what you've said about text 1. You could then move on and make a possible link to a third text if you felt there was a worthwhile comparison to be made there. And again, you would lead yourself to a conclusion where you make an evaluative comparison. You argue which text shows the greatest suffering. It's important to point out that both approaches can result in A-star essays. So one is not any better than the other. It is all about writing in detail and making sure your points of comparison are very specific and very insightful. So however you do this, your introduction will still do these things. It will succinctly identify the main causes, forms, and impacts of suffering seen in your chosen texts, and it will provide a short overall comparison of the 2 or 3 texts. So while you'll go into a lot of detail in the rest of the essay, focusing on particular comparisons, you will, in your opening paragraph, want to provide a sense of the scope of this essay. Look at the overall comparison, even if it's just pointing out about one being a poem, one being a prose extract, and how they are about different topics. The characters involved, what's the difference between them? So making sure you really do understand the differences between these texts, but also any interesting similarities that you'll then be able to refer back to in more detail later in the essay. You really want to try to communicate in no more than 4 sentences what each text is about, what the writer is showing us about suffering, and what the main similarities and differences between your texts are. And you can do that. Your introduction may well need quite a few versions to make sure that you get it spot on, but it's so important as it sets the tone for the whole essay, so really do try and accomplish this. Let's go back to the mark scheme and the very top band, band 9, to see what does it actually mean. Well, if you look at the first phrase about students showing originality of analysis and interpretation when evaluating texts, it means don't just rely on ideas discussed in class. Try to make your own points. Now, I know this is challenging, but it's about trying to show that you haven't just turned out every single thing that was said in class, but you'd had to think yourself about associations of words, or you've maybe spotted a connection that others hadn't thought about. Now, also, this idea about interpretation and looking at different ideas is really important in the detail of your analysis. Try and consider different ways of reading a text. So when you explain what a word or phrase might mean, do comment on how it could be interpreted in different ways. Sometimes words don't always just mean one thing. It may well mean that they could have a very different meaning if you read something from a different perspective. Now that's what the very top essays will be showing. They'll be picking out the key phrases that you could read in different ways, and then they'll be justifying the idea of which interpretation I think is most valid. That comes to my third point, that the evaluating aspect is to make a judgment. Which interpretation do you think is the strongest and why? Being able to say maybe one word could mean this or it could mean that. And personally, I think the second meaning is the most likely meaning because of another piece of evidence in the poem, for example. Evaluation also means things like judging which form of suffering you find the most emotionally striking and why that may be the case. So once you've identified all the different ways that people are suffering in the text, being able to pick out one and say, this is the one that particularly hits me hard and this is why it does. You also get asked to show flair and precision in developing your ideas. So this means write with clarity, eloquence, and technicality. Use terminology where it's appropriate. Go back to your table, your list of terms that you can use. Make sure you always embed your quotations properly and you write accurately and you write fluidly so that this is a real joy to read. That's why you need to make sure that you proofread carefully and you read your essay aloud so you can hear what it sounds like and you make sure you make changes. Lastly, about making subtle and discriminating comparisons. This means making really precise comparisons. Focus on single word choices and structural features. So while in your introduction you may say something about how one poem shows one person suffering and the prose text shows multiple suffering, don't just do that in your whole essay then. Try and pick out a particular adjective perhaps to describe the suffering and comment on how that's different to in one of the other texts where you get a different sense of how people are suffering. This will show that you really are able to look at details in a text. So when you are doing comparisons between texts, this is what you need to consider. What are the similarities or differences in a specific area? And this basically means making a precise statement on what the writers show and what is similar and different. Then you need to think, how are those similarities and differences shown? And this means quoting single words or phrases, labeling terminology, and explaining meanings and effects of language and structure choices. So that's where you get to the real nitty-gritty detail and make sure you provide the exact evidence to support your observation of the comparison. And then the tricky bit that really will mark out your essay as being brilliant is where you explain why the text explore those aspects in similar or different ways. So that's where you need to look at the context of a quotation. Maybe think about why a word in one context might mean something different in another context. Think about how a poem is different to an extract from a novel. Think about how the subject matter might affect the way that suffering is presented, the time in which something's written, the perspective of a character, etc. How do all these things impact interpretation? For the drafting process that you will be undertaking, we'll be studying in class 3 of these texts, and there are additional videos that you can go to and find on YouTube to read, to watch to get some more ideas, and you'll do a practice mini essay on Out Out. Then there'll be the writing of the first draft, and you will self-assess and check this thoroughly before handing it in. I shouldn't be finding your spelling mistakes and punctuation errors or your embedding of quotations. You should be finding those things. I should be looking for how I can point you in the direction of even more detailed analysis and connections. Then you will write your final draft after you've received back my comments on your first draft, and your final draft you again self-assess and check thoroughly before handing it in. And you should be able to position yourself in a band on the mark scheme. You should have a real idea of where your essay is going to end up. Okay, so as usual, if there are any other questions, please come and ask me or email, but I hope that helps explain what it is that you'll be doing and how to approach the essay.